Marcus Trent was just out for a drive. Nothing unusual, nothing dramatic. He wasn't looking for trouble. But when a truck covered in racist flags cut him off at a red light, and the white couple inside rolled down their window to hurl insults his way, something in the air shifted. He answered back, unwilling to be walked over. But when the light turned green, they drove off, and Marcus thought it was over. He never expected to come home the next day and find his garage spray-painted, his medals, his flag, destroyed, his house violated. He didn't start this. But now that it's been brought to his door, he's going to finish it. They thought they were just dealing with another black man who'd take the abuse and move on. They didn't know they'd picked a fight with a Marine, and they have no idea what's coming next. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe. The sun hung low behind the ridgeline, spilling molten gold across the roofs of the suburban neighborhood like it was trying too hard to make the world look kinder than it was. The streets were quiet, too clean, like they'd been scrubbed of anything raw or real. Not a single car door slammed, no kids yelling down the block. Just the soft hum of sprinklers ticking rhythmically through manicured lawns, and a warm breeze swaying through perfectly trimmed hedges that lined the edges of driveways like polite sentinels. It was the kind of place built on appearances, where smiles were polite, waves were shallow, and silence stretched like wallpaper over deeper, older rot. Marcus Trent stood in his driveway with his sleeves rolled to his elbows, one hand resting absently on the polished fender of his midnight black Challenger, the other holding a half-finished bottle of water that had long since gone warm. His eyes weren't on the car, though. They never really were. They were on the row of houses across the street, the ones with flags posted just a little too proudly, the ones where neighbors gave nods instead of greetings and locked their doors a beat too fast after waving. He didn't blame them. Not entirely. Fear wrapped in pleasantries was still fear. And he'd learned a long time ago that fear didn't always scream. Sometimes it just looked away. The car gleamed under the sinking sun, its hood long and unforgiving, every inch of it a quiet dare. He'd bought it 2 months ago, not because he needed it, but because he'd earned it. 10 years in the Corps, 5 deployed overseas, 3 with a scope pressed to his cheekbone, and the last 2 spent quietly rebuilding a life civilians would never understand. The car wasn't loud or gaudy. It didn't need to be. It was efficient, powerful, and unapologetic. Like him. He took a final sip of water, tossed the empty bottle into the bin by the garage, and clicked the lock on the front door behind him. The house still smelled faintly of fresh paint and unboxed memories, like it hadn't quite decided whether it was his or just a place he was passing through. But it was his. His name on the deed, his fingerprints on the locks, and his blood in every square inch of its piece. As he backed out of the driveway, tires whispering against the smooth concrete, he flicked the stereo on. No music, just the low rumble of the engine filling the cabin like a heartbeat. The streets unfolded in soft curves as he drove. Everything too neat, too symmetrical. Every mailbox stood straight, every lawn trimmed to regulation perfection. But even in all that order, Marcus couldn't help but scan each corner, each passing vehicle, every parked car with an engine still ticking. It wasn't paranoia, it was habit. Some things you didn't unlearn. He headed toward the old service road that ran along the edge of town, a quicker route to the hardware store where he needed a few things for the garage shelving. Nothing urgent, just one of those errands he kept putting off. The road was quieter this time of day, lined with crumbling fences and abandoned lots that had once been promised as parks or shops, but never saw a single foundation poured. That's when he saw it. A battered, lifted pickup truck eased into the lane ahead of him from a side street, its exhaust sputtering loud enough to echo against the concrete barrier. The rear window was a collage of hate, stickers with thinly veiled threats masked as slogans, flags that dripped with venom disguised as pride, Slogans like, "Take America Back" and "You people should be grateful." Marcus exhaled through his nose, a slow release, not of fear, but calculation. The truck veered left without signaling, drifting over the center line like it owned the road, its tires fat and aggressive. Marcus slowed. He wasn't about to get sideswiped by someone too bitter to steer straight. At the next stoplight, the truck jerked across both lanes, forcing its way in front of him with a screech of brakes. No signal, no apology, just entitlement, wearing steel and rust. Marcus's jaw tensed. He lifted his foot off the gas and coasted to a stop behind them. The brake lights bathed his hood in red. He wasn't the type to escalate. He hadn't made it this far by chasing every insult. But this wasn't an insult. This was deliberate. They knew what they were doing. In the truck's side mirror, he could see the driver now, white, maybe late 40s, with a gut pressing against a camouflage vest that had never seen service. The woman in the passenger seat was thinner, wiry, with stringy blonde hair and an expression that spoke of long years spent bitter. They were talking to each other, laughing, like they'd just finished a joke at his expense. And then the man turned his head, just slightly, and gave Marcus a look through the mirror. Not fear, not indifference, just smug, calloused hatred. Like Marcus wasn't a man, just a presence he could toy with. Marcus leaned back in his seat, didn't even flinch. The light stayed red. His fingers flexed on the steering wheel. The Challenger idled low, ready, waiting. So was he. The light turned green, but Marcus didn't floor the accelerator the way some men might have. Not when pride or ego pulled at the wheel. He eased into the lane with deliberate calm, letting the Challenger's power glide smoothly forward, the hum of the engine low and restrained beneath him, as if it too understood there was a weight to this moment that didn't require noise to carry force. Up ahead, the rust-eaten pickup truck had already swerved into the fast lane without signaling, weaving through slower traffic with the reckless entitlement of someone who believed the world would always get out of their way. Marcus let them pull ahead. Not far, just enough to watch, to measure, to choose his response not from impulse, but from intention. They thought they'd had their laugh, thought the flash of their bumper stickers and the reckless stunt at the previous light had given them the last word. But Marcus had been trained in restraint, in the discipline of waiting, and when he finally pressed down on the gas and changed lanes, the act carried none of the pettiness they might have expected. It was clean, surgical. He accelerated just enough to draw even, then flicked his signal once, not for courtesy, but for precision, before cutting smoothly in front of them, not jerking, not slamming the brakes, just reclaiming the space they had stolen moments ago. It wasn't aggression. It was balance, a simple, quiet correction they weren't used to receiving. Behind him, the truck honked. A sharp, shrill burst meant to provoke. He didn't flinch. He could feel the tension spool tighter with every second they followed, the space between their bumper and his rear tightening in challenge, the rev of their engine growing more agitated as the next red light loomed up ahead, like a stage no one had rehearsed for, but both were already stepping onto. The light turned red. Marcus coasted to a stop. The truck lurched in behind him, tail practically kissing his bumper, as though trying to press him forward by force alone. He rolled down his window, not fully, just enough to breathe, to speak, if he chose. The afternoon heat curled through the opening. Tires hissed on the asphalt. Somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower buzzed like a dull saw. Then came the sound of their doors swinging open. He didn't move at first, just turned his head, eyes following them in the side mirror. Doug stepped out of the truck with the kind of gait Marcus had seen too many times before. Shoulders rolled forward, chest puffed, the clumsy swagger of a man who'd never been in a real fight, but had told plenty of stories about ones he swore he won. His shirt clung to his gut, sweat bleeding through at the armpits, and in one hand he held a crumpled cigarette that he'd forgotten to light. Sherry slid out from the passenger side, thin arms folded across her chest, eyes scanning Marcus with the same look people reserved for things they considered beneath them. Disposable, inconvenient, unworthy of being in their line of sight. Marcus stepped out of his car in one fluid motion, not hurried, not tense, just steady, like someone with nothing to prove and no fear of what came next. His boots landed square on the pavement. He didn't raise his voice, didn't posture, just looked Doug dead in the eye and said, "Something you need?" Doug scoffed, gesturing wildly with his cigarette hand, already playing to an invisible crowd. "You think you're tough, boy? Swerving like that. You ain't got no damn business on these roads if you don't know how to drive." Marcus didn't answer right away. He just looked at the man, gaze steady, measuring. "You cut me off first. I corrected it." Sherry stepped forward then, voice sharp and nasal. "You people always gotta play the victim. You act like you're so oppressed. But here you are, driving some fancy car, acting like you own the damn road." Marcus turned toward her, not sharply, just enough to center her in his line of sight. "And what exactly do you mean by you people?" "You know damn well what I mean," Doug snapped, stepping closer. "You think you're special, huh? Flashing that car around this neighborhood like you belong here. We know what you types are really about." Marcus let the words sit there for a beat, heavy in the air, not reacting to the slur hidden just beneath the surface, just breathing through the disgust rising in his throat. The memory of so many times he'd heard it before, in different tones, different mouths, always aimed to chip away at dignity. "Say it plain," he said finally, his voice low and even. "If you're gonna spit that filth, at least have the spine to speak without code." Doug's nostrils flared. "Oh, I'll say it. You don't belong here, boy. This ain't your kind of place. We built this town. You just moved in like a cockroach crawling into a clean house." Marcus stepped forward once, not fast, not aggressive, just close enough that Doug had to lean back a half step. "I earned every damn inch of what I have. While you were sitting on your porch blaming the world for your failures, I was overseas pulling bodies out of rubble. I fought for this country, bled for it, and I'll be damned if I let a coward like you tell me where I do or don't belong." Sherry laughed then, high-pitched, brittle, shrill. "You ain't no hero. You're just another thug with a chip on your shoulder. Probably lied to get that uniform. Bet you got kicked out." Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't reach for his wallet. Didn't show her the medal he carried, the one tucked behind the registration in his glove box. He didn't need to. Doug spat on the ground near his boots. "People like you think respect comes with a car and a uniform, but it don't. You'll always just be what you are." Marcus looked him in the eye. "Then you'd better pray I stay what I am. Because if I ever stop holding back, you'll learn real fast what I can be." The light turned green. Marcus got back in his car, never breaking eye contact until the door closed. Doug stood there, still red in the face, fists clenched, breathing hard. But he didn't follow, not yet. 10 minutes later, the tires eased back into his driveway with a soft crunch, the low rumble of the engine tapering off as Marcus shifted into park and sat still for a moment, one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel, the other brushing over the key without turning it just yet. The light outside had begun to soften, shadows stretching long across the lawn, the heat of the day still clinging to the pavement in slow, shimmering waves. The neighborhood remained quiet, unnaturally so, like it had been holding its breath since he left. He glanced once toward the house, eyes moving across the porch, the blinds in the front window still half drawn, the garden hose coiled neatly near the steps, untouched since the morning. Nothing felt out of place. No curtain moved, no dog barked, just stillness, familiar, safe. He finally turned the key and the engine went silent, the ticking of cooling metal taking its place. The moment held a kind of peace he hadn't had on active deployments, a pause he no longer took for granted, one that meant the world stayed outside his walls, if only temporarily. He stepped out of the car, closed the door with measured quiet, and rounded the back toward the mailbox, already sorting through the stack in his head. Some bills, maybe another flyer about that HOA meeting he hadn't decided whether to attend. He was halfway across the lawn when he heard it. That unmistakable cough of a diesel engine, low and uneven, like a snarl wrapped in rust. He turned. The pickup truck rolled up slow and deliberate, tires crawling against the curb as if savoring the moment, like the street itself belonged to them. He hadn't even seen them behind him. No headlights in the mirror, no shadow in the corner of his eye. They'd followed him the entire way. Silent, careful, deliberate, like hunters, like cowards. Marcus straightened, letting the mail hang loosely in one hand, the other lowering to his side as the truck came to a stop just feet from the edge of his lawn. The engine idled like a threat, growling beneath its own weight. The doors didn't open right away. Instead, Doug sat behind the wheel with both hands gripping it too tightly, jaw clenched, staring straight ahead like he was trying to decide if stepping out would make him more of a man or get him killed. Sherry leaned forward in the passenger seat, her eyes narrowed, mouth already moving before the door even creaked open. Marcus didn't move. He didn't speak, didn't raise a hand or shift his stance. He just waited. Doug stepped out first, slower than before. The bravado dulled now that they weren't in traffic, now that there were no cars between them and no lights to run. Sherry followed, slamming the door harder than necessary, her sneakers crunching across the edge of Marcus's lawn like she was daring it to react. "You think that little stunt back there was cute?" Doug's voice carried with the same bluster as before, but it cracked slightly at the edges, like he was trying to convince himself that he hadn't made a mistake. "You think you can show us up and just drive off like you own the place?" Marcus didn't answer, didn't need to. The silence itself was a statement, carved into every muscle of his frame, every line of his expression. "You damn people always think you can do whatever the hell you want," Sherry added, voice climbing sharper with each word. "But not here. Not in this neighborhood. We don't just roll over and let your kind act like kings." "You followed me home," Marcus said, voice calm, even, with the kind of controlled intensity that cut deeper than shouting ever could. "You crossed that line." "Not me. We live here too," Doug said, gesturing wildly to the street like that somehow justified the trespass. "We got just as much right to walk this block as anybody. What? You think you can throw your little Marine card around, and we're supposed to bow? That it?" Marcus stepped forward, one slow stride that seemed to drop the temperature by degrees. "I didn't ask for respect. I didn't ask for anything. You brought this to my house." Doug stepped in to meet him, trying to close the distance, puffing his chest, as if proximity alone could tilt the balance. "You don't scare me, tough guy. You think that buzz cut and a black belt mean anything out here? You're just another angry thug in a nice car." And just like that, the mask slipped fully. No more coded language. No more pretense. Just raw, ugly venom. The kind Marcus had tasted before, overseas, back home, on both sides of the uniform. "You should leave," Marcus said, eyes locked on Doug's, every word deliberate. "You had your performance. Now go." Sherry threw her hands up. "You see this, Doug? You see how they act? Threatening us right on his own lawn. Like we're the problem." Doug didn't move. Something behind his eyes flickered. Pride, rage, maybe the realization that Marcus wasn't bluffing. Maybe something deeper, older, buried under years of thinking men like Marcus were supposed to keep their heads down. Then Doug lunged. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't trained. It was wild, desperate, the kind of swing a man throws when words fail and image feels threatened. Marcus moved as if he'd seen it a full second before it happened. He caught Doug's wrist mid-swing, twisted gently. Not to break, not yet, but to redirect, and used the man's own weight to send him stumbling forward, off balance and panting. Marcus stepped aside, controlled, precise, as Doug nearly toppled over the low hedge lining the yard. He didn't throw a punch. He didn't raise his voice. But when he turned toward Sherry, who had backed herself behind the truck door, the warning in his eyes was absolute. "I told you," he said, voice low. "You don't come to my house." Doug scrambled to his feet, face flushed deep red, chest heaving as he pulled Sherry into the truck. She shouted something about calling the police, about lawsuits, about Marcus being finished. But the engine drowned it out as Doug peeled away from the curb, tires screaming against pavement, rubber streaking the street like a scar. Marcus didn't move until the truck disappeared around the corner. Then, slowly, he turned back toward his house, the mail still clutched in his hand, one envelope torn at the corner, fluttering gently in the breeze like a flag waiting to fall. The moon had climbed higher by the time Marcus finally allowed the quiet of the house to settle fully around him, its pale light drifting through the upstairs window in long, unbroken ribbons that stretched across the hardwood floor like distant memories returning uninvited. He sat in the living room without the television on, without music, without anything but the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the slow, even rhythm of his own breathing. The mail sat unopened on the coffee table beside his keys, and the house, though unchanged in layout, felt subtly different now, like it had shifted, recoiled, absorbed something that didn't belong. He leaned back into the couch, arms folded, eyes fixed not on the window or the room itself, but on some point beyond them, some quiet middle distance only he could see. The confrontation had ended without sirens, without neighbors emerging from behind half-drawn curtains, without the kind of spectacle Doug had probably hoped for. But Marcus knew that men like Doug didn't retreat. Not really. They fumed, they brooded, they stewed in resentment until it burned them hollow, and then they looked for something to smash so they could feel whole again. He had seen it in war zones, in back alleys, in interrogation rooms. Men who mistook humiliation for injustice and responded with cruelty not because they were brave, but because it was the only power they had left. That's what lingered now. Not fear, but anticipation. The kind that buzzed just beneath the surface, not loud enough to shout, but impossible to ignore. Upstairs, the floor creaked softly under his steps as he moved into the bedroom, pausing by the small dresser near the closet, where a plain wooden box rested beneath a folded flag. He opened it carefully, pulling out the medal from his second tour. A simple bronze star, nothing ornate, nothing flashy, just solid weight and silence. He turned it over once in his hand, running a thumb over the inscription, then placed it gently back in its case. He didn't wear his past like a badge. He didn't need to. But tonight, it grounded him, reminded him that restraint wasn't weakness, that dignity wasn't silence, that peace wasn't something the world handed over freely. It was something you earned, something you fought for, and sometimes something you defended without ever firing a shot. He didn't sleep well. The dreams came light and scattered, flickers of desert heat and distant gunfire, of rooftops and dust, and voices speaking languages he'd once understood well enough to read fear in. When the alarm broke the haze just past 6, he sat up without groaning, feet planted firm on the floor, spine straight. His routine didn't change. 40 push-ups, cold shower, eggs and black coffee. Precision wasn't vanity, it was survival. Long after the battlefield stopped looking like one, he left for work just after 7, driving the Challenger like always, music off, windows down, letting the wind speak in its place. The sun hadn't fully cleared the rooftops when he turned the corner back into his street that evening, muscles loose from the gym, his mind already pivoting toward dinner. He still had some grilled chicken from 2 nights ago and a half-full bag of jasmine rice that just needed 15 minutes and a little patience. He wasn't prepared for the stillness, not the usual suburban kind, the quiet hum of lawn sprinklers or the occasional bark from a dog behind a wooden fence, but a heavier kind, like the street had swallowed its voice, like it was holding back the truth just long enough for him to see it himself. He pulled into the driveway slowly. At first, it didn't register. The garage door looked the same, closed like he'd left it. The front yard was still intact. No broken glass, no smashed window. But then he saw it, the paint. Bright, dripping red and harsh black, slashed across the garage in thick, chaotic letters that screamed the filth they hadn't had the courage to say to his face the night before. Racial slurs sprawled in uneven lines, crooked and cruel, some half misspelled, all unmistakable in their intent. The word boy had been written 3 times across the garage panel, each larger than the last, each one followed by curses and bile from a century that refused to die. His boots crunched something soft as he stepped out of the car. Shredded paper, charred remnants. The photo from his mantle, the one of his unit on deployment, had been torn, burned at the edges, and tossed into the grass like garbage. His American flag had been ripped from its pole and stabbed into the ground upside down. The worst of it, though, wasn't visible from the street. His military commendations, meticulously framed, once hanging in a line along the interior garage wall, had been pulled down, their glass shattered, and their certificates defaced. They had smashed one of his medals underfoot, the ribbon torn, the metal bent, like they had wanted to break what they couldn't earn. Marcus didn't speak, didn't shout. He stood there, shoulders still, jaw tight, as the breeze pushed gently against the back of his neck, mocking the heat building beneath his skin. He could feel it. Not rage, not yet, but something colder, sharper, a slow burn rising from his gut to his throat, like a tide he couldn't quite choke down. It wasn't about property. It wasn't even about insult. It was about the message they thought they'd delivered. That no matter how clean his lawn, how new his car, how honorable his service, they could still come for him, still remind him, still try to drag him back down to the image they'd crafted in their heads of what a man like him was supposed to be. But they had miscalculated. They hadn't just defaced his house. They had drawn first blood. The air had already begun to turn by the time the squad car arrived. Late evening shadows stretching long across the driveway as Marcus stood, with his arms crossed just beyond the edge of the spray-painted slurs. He hadn't touched anything. Not the door, not the wreckage near the bushes, not even the scorched photo lying near the sidewalk. Everything remained as it was, left to speak for itself in the language of hatred that needed no translation. He'd called it in without emotion, giving the dispatcher his name and address with calm clarity, the same way he used to relay coordinates under enemy fire. No room for panic, no time for noise. The cruiser rolled to a stop with deliberate care, its lights flashing lazily but without sirens, like the officer inside already suspected this was the kind of call no one wanted to handle too quickly. A woman stepped out, a Latina in plain navy slacks, her badge clipped to her belt, and eyes sharp behind narrow frames. She didn't speak right away, just scanned the damage in slow, deliberate arcs, her jaw tightening slightly as she took in each layer of it. "Detective April Castillo," she said finally, walking up with a clipboard tucked under one arm. "You're Mr. Trent?" Marcus nodded once. "I am." She gestured toward the vandalism. "You touch anything?" "No. I left it exactly as I found it when I got home 20 minutes ago." She scribbled something onto her form, then stepped forward and began moving along the perimeter, taking photos with her phone, occasionally crouching near the broken frames or the splattered paint to record details up close. Her silence wasn't the awkward kind. She was processing, cataloging, running through protocol. Marcus watched her work, his arms still folded, his jaw clenched not in anger, but in frustration honed down to a fine point. It took 10 minutes before she looked up again. "You got enemies?" she asked, voice flat, but not unkind. "Not that live on this street," he answered. "Neighbors? Any confrontations?" "There was an incident yesterday. Road rage. They followed me home. White male, Late 40s, about 6 feet. White female passenger. Confederate flags. Racist stickers. Lifted Dodge pickup. Plate was rusted over. Names? Not yet, Marcus said. She gave him a look. Not doubt, but the kind that hinted she'd heard that answer more than once this month. You get a picture? Plate number? No. I didn't think they'd be this stupid. Castillo sighed through her nose, jotting more notes. Cameras? Marcus gestured to the corner of his garage. Motion sensor. But the lens was smashed. Must have been the first thing they hit. Neighbors? She asked, angling her head toward the other houses. Anyone got a ring cam or something similar? They all like their privacy too much to put their secrets on record. She gave a faint, humorless chuckle. Sounds about right. Another moment passed as she walked the perimeter again. A second cruiser arrived, uniformed officers stepping out with yellow tape and a few more evidence bags, moving with the kind of cautious efficiency that told Marcus this wasn't their first call like this. He watched them work, but he already knew how it would end. Castillo returned, glancing down at her clipboard before meeting his eyes again. I'll file this under hate-based vandalism, but with no plate, no footage, and unless a neighbor suddenly remembers their conscience, there's not a lot we can do right now. Marcus said nothing. I'll canvass the block, she added, tone dipping toward empathy. See if anyone's willing to speak off the record. But I'm going to be honest with you, Mr. Trent. This kind of thing, people clam up fast. No one wants to be involved. Except the people who painted it. Castillo nodded grimly. They always find their courage in the dark. He looked at her then, not coldly, not even accusingly, but with the quiet weight of a man who had spent his life waiting for justice, only to find it constantly rationed. You ever seen someone do something like this and just stop afterward? Her gaze flicked toward the house, the garage, the scorched metal now bagged for evidence. No, she said. They escalate, but they get sloppy too. So if they're dumb enough to come back, we might get lucky. I don't put much faith in luck, Marcus replied. Then put some in me, she said, voice softening just slightly. I'll do what I can, but keep your eyes open, Mr. Trent. I'd advise against retaliation, even if it's deserved. He met her eyes. Don't worry, detective. I'm not looking for revenge. And that was true. Revenge came from anger. What he felt wasn't that. It was something colder, something sharper, a kind of calculation that had nothing to do with heat and everything to do with precision. He hadn't survived a decade in the Corps by letting rage cloud his judgment. What he needed now wasn't permission. It was information. Once Castillo and the other officers cleared the scene, once the last photo was taken, and the final strip of yellow tape secured around the hedges, Marcus went back inside. He didn't touch the damage, didn't scrub the words off the garage. That would come later. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and pen, drawing the truck from memory. Every detail he could recall. The shape of the headlights, the angle of the lift, the sequence of stickers on the rear window, the way the driver leaned to the left as he turned, the rough scrape along the side panel near the wheel well. He circled 3 parts of the drawing and underlined them. Then, without hesitation, he picked up his phone and called Reggie. You still know the guy who runs that body shop near the highway? He asked. Yeah, Reggie replied on the other end. Why? I need access to their security footage. Yesterday. Late afternoon, off the feeder road by Eastwood. Looking for something specific? Marcus looked at the drawing again. At the stickers, the flags, the warped metal that would have been hard to miss. Yeah, he said. I'm looking for a truck that doesn't know it's already been seen. The next morning broke over the neighborhood with all the artificial warmth of a manufactured piece. Golden light spilling over rooftops and picket fences like a veil laid across yesterday's wounds. The slurs still stained the garage in blood-red letters, the paint crusting now under the early sun. And not a single neighbor had spoken, not a word, not a glance. The silence had taken on a sharper shape than the vandalism itself. Marcus didn't wait for anyone to explain it. He didn't need an apology to know what was meant by the way they all avoided looking toward his house, the same way you look away from a body in the street when you're afraid acknowledging it might mean you're next. He left early. The garage door stayed closed. Let them see what they'd done. Let them wonder what kind of man would let it sit there untouched. Not because he didn't care, but because he wanted every one of them to live with it, just for a while. By the time he rolled into the back lot behind Reggie's gym, the morning haze was just beginning to lift. The building stood squat and worn between an old tire shop and a boarded-up liquor store. Its steel frame painted over so many times, the color had settled somewhere between gunmetal and stubbornness. Marcus stepped out and rapped twice on the side door, waiting as the bolt slid free. Reggie Jones opened it with the kind of energy that didn't need words, just a look. One glance down the alley, then back to Marcus with the question already in his eyes. Marcus didn't speak until they were inside, past the scent of sweat and iron, past the empty mats and quiet punching bags. They moved into the office, where dust hung faint in the light, and the old fan on the desk rotated in half-hearted turns. "You got the footage?" Marcus asked, already lowering himself into the chair by the desk. Reggie pulled a flash drive from the pocket of his hoodie and handed it over without a word. "I called in a favor from Ramon," he said. "Got everything from the shop next door. Their angle picked up half the lot. There's a camera facing the feeder road, too. Catches anyone pulling in from Eastwood." Marcus slid the drive into the laptop and opened the folder. Grainy footage rolled out across the screen, time-stamped and silent. He fast-forwarded through an hour's worth of empty frames, flickers of passing traffic, a few customers, a delivery van, until something clicked. There it was. The Dodge. Even in washed-out grayscale, it stood out, lifted high, loud in presence even without sound, and unmistakably marked with the twisted collage of flags and hate stickers bleeding across the back window. The driver's door opened. Doug stepped out, his build unmistakable. The same hunched posture, the same exaggerated gestures as he barked something at a shop attendant and waved toward the hood. Marcus leaned in closer. The image wasn't sharp enough to catch a plate, but the first three characters were visible. 7. Not enough for an arrest, but more than enough to start peeling back layers. Reggie crossed his arms, watching. "That him? That's him. What's the move?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He continued watching the footage, observing every frame. How Doug walked, where he parked, the way he leaned into conversations like he was performing even when no one was watching. Sherry didn't step out of the truck, but her silhouette was there in the passenger seat, head moving, probably talking, probably directing. "I don't want to rattle them," Marcus said finally. "I want to learn them, where they go, what they do, how often they slip. Why?" Marcus didn't look away from the screen. "Because people like this think they're untouchable. I want to remind them they're not." Reggie exhaled slowly. "You want to teach them a lesson, not out of spite," Marcus said, his voice measured, the words chosen with care. "Not out of rage. This isn't revenge. They picked a fight in the dark and thought I'd break like the last man they came for. But this time, they're going to feel what it means to face someone who doesn't move on." Reggie watched him for a moment, nodding once. "You always did play the long game." Marcus clicked through more footage. Another angle showing the truck pulling out an hour later, turning west toward the industrial park. "Tomorrow, I'll start tailing him," Marcus said. "Different car, no close following. I'll keep a log. Patterns, contacts. And then," Reggie asked, though his voice carried more curiosity than concern, "then I'll decide." Reggie nodded again, slower this time. "You want backup?" "Not yet. This part's quiet. Eyes only." Over the next several days, Marcus moved through town like a shadow. No uniform, no car anyone would recognize, just a beat-up silver sedan borrowed from Reggie's cousin, and a notebook tucked beneath the seat. He followed from a distance, patient, deliberate. Doug's routines revealed themselves in small increments. A grocery store on Tuesdays, gas station beer runs in the afternoon, Stops at a backlot dive bar 2 nights in a row, where the same cluster of men gathered around a rusted fire pit, with their sleeves rolled up and their ignorance rolled deeper. Marcus never approached. He simply watched. Logged timestamps, noted license plates, watched who Doug shook hands with, who he avoided, how long he stayed in one place. Every piece of information was stacked into a file that slowly began to shape something larger than just an address or a name. He wasn't building a case for the police. He was building clarity for himself, first and foremost. Doug wasn't just a man with a chip on his shoulder. He was a man who had gotten away with this before. The casual confidence in his gait, the familiarity with where to go and who to see, it all pointed to history. He'd done this. He'd hurt people, and the town had let him. But this time, someone had been watching, and this time, the silence wouldn't hold. By the end of the week, Marcus knew more about Doug and Sherry Mallon than their own neighbors did. Where they shopped, who they drank with, what time they left the house, and what time they dragged themselves back. The truth wasn't surprising. They were creatures of routine, driven more by ego than need, tethered to familiar places and people who nodded along to their ignorance because it made them feel less alone in it. They didn't think twice about the noise they made, the words they spewed, or the faces they sneered at from their rusted throne on 4 wheels, because no one had ever made them think twice. Until now. So when Marcus spotted their truck behind the old bait shop, parked crooked under a sagging live oak, no cameras, no foot traffic, he knew it was the right time. Not because his patience had run out, but because silence only taught so much. Sooner or later, consequences had to speak louder. They were alone. Doug leaned against the tailgate with a cheap beer in hand, legs splayed wide like he thought it made him larger. Sherry sat on the bumper, picking at her nails, wearing sunglasses despite the overcast sky. They looked relaxed, unbothered, like the world still bent to them and always would. Marcus stepped out of his borrowed sedan and crossed the gravel lot without a word, boots crunching beneath him in deliberate rhythm. The couple turned as one, and Doug straightened slightly when he recognized the face. Sherry pulled off her sunglasses with a smirk that had already soured before it fully formed. "Well, well," she called out. "If it ain't the neighborhood watch." Doug grinned without humor. "You seriously following us now? What? That pretty little house of yours too lonely without someone to blame?" Marcus stopped 6 feet from them, shoulders squared, posture still. "You wanted to be seen," he said quietly. "So here I am, seeing you." Doug snorted. "Man's got jokes. You drive around in a billboard of hate," Marcus continued, eyes fixed on him, voice steady. "Flags, slogans, threats on the back window. Then you follow a black man home, vandalize his house, desecrate his service, and think no one's gonna put the pieces together?" Sherry's grin twisted into something crueler. "Ah, honey, is that what this is about? You think we spray-painted your little garage? That we smashed up your precious metals?" Doug stepped forward, arms out. "You got no proof. You think just 'cause we called you out, now we're suspects? That's your problem, man. Always crying wolf, always looking for someone to blame when the world don't bend over for you." "You came to my house," Marcus said, unmoving. "You crossed that line, and I'd cross it again," Doug spat. "'Cause it ain't your house. You don't belong there. You don't belong in that neighborhood, in that car, with that flag, that uniform you wore. Just a costume. Just another lie you people put on to act like you matter." Sherry laughed, high and shrill. "You think wearing a uniform makes you one of us? That it washes off where you came from? You're not a Marine. You're not a hero. You're just another stray dog wearing somebody else's tags." Something in Marcus's jaw tightened, but his eyes didn't change. He stood in absolute stillness, the kind that made the air shift, the kind that said there was still room to walk away, even if barely. Then Doug stepped closer, close enough for his breath to mix with the humidity, and muttered the sentence that cracked the world in half. "You want justice? he said, leaning in. "Go ask your daddy why he didn't teach you how to stay in your place. Oh, wait. Let me guess. He bailed too." The moment that followed wasn't loud. It wasn't fast. It was a silence so complete it rang. And then Marcus moved. No warning, no flourish. Just a blur of movement as his left hand caught Doug's wrist mid-gesture and yanked him forward, off balance, directly into a short, surgical elbow to the jaw. Doug dropped the beer. Then he dropped entirely, knees buckling as his body slammed to the gravel with a dull, breathless thud. Before he could recover, Marcus was on him, not pounding, not screaming, but methodical. One strike to the rib cage, another to the shoulder joint, a final flattening blow to the sternum that left Doug gasping like a fish on concrete. Sherry screamed and scrambled backward, kicking up dust as she tried to climb into the truck. Marcus didn't follow her. He stood, breathing controlled. Stance clean. Doug writhed on the ground, coughing, bleeding from a split lip, his mouth working, but no words coming out. Marcus looked down at him with quiet precision. "You think you can tear down what I've built because you feel small, but the truth is, I don't care about what you feel," he said, voice low. "Not for theatrics, but because it was all he needed. You wanted to remind me who I am, so let me return the favor." He knelt just low enough that Doug had to look at him, blood trickling from the side of his mouth. "I am not your fear. I'm not your scapegoat. I'm not the lie you tell yourself about stolen pride and shifting culture. I'm the man who gives you the warning shot before the world comes knocking harder." Doug tried to sit up, but Marcus placed a boot gently against his chest, not crushing, just enough to remind him he wasn't standing again until Marcus said so. "You will feel this every time you step out of line, every time you see my face, every time you look in a mirror and remember the day a man you thought you could break didn't just stand tall. He put you in the dirt." Then he stepped back. Let Doug gasp. Let Sherry sob and scream empty threats from the driver's seat. Marcus turned without a backward glance and started walking away. Marcus turned from the broken mess at his feet with the calm of a man who'd already returned to center. Doug was groaning now, barely able to curl onto his side, his pride shattered even more thoroughly than his lip. And Sherry, speechless for once, stood frozen beside the truck, fists clenched, mouth twisted around a scream that hadn't quite decided whether to come out or swallow itself whole. He didn't look back at them again. Didn't need to. The air was still and hot, the gravel crunching beneath his boots as he made his way back across the lot. Steps measured, posture steady, chest rising with each breath, like it had on 1,000 long walks away from things that could have ended worse. His leg ached slightly from where Doug's boot had grazed it during the scuffle, but the pain was background noise, irrelevant to the precision of the moment. Behind him, the truck door creaked open. He heard it, but didn't react. It wasn't until the engine roared back to life, louder this time, angry, shaken, that he slowed, half-turning, his brow drawing down just slightly. Sherry was behind the wheel. Doug was still slumped against the door, barely upright, bleeding freely. His voice slurred as he barked something Marcus couldn't hear through the growl of the engine. And then Sherry's foot hit the gas. The tires screamed. Marcus moved, not fast, calculated. He spun toward the tree line just off the edge of the lot, knees bending as he dove for cover. But she wasn't aiming for center mass. She didn't need to. Her aim was lower, meaner, messier. The truck clipped him at the edge of his dive, the front corner catching the back of his thigh with a punishing thud that sent pain tearing up into his hip. He landed hard, breath jolting from his lungs as his shoulder slammed into the dirt, gravel scraping across his ribs and elbow. The truck kept going. Momentum carried it in a crooked line past him, tires skidding as she jerked the wheel and fishtailed the tailgate dangerously close to a rusted generator at the back of the lot. The rear bumper slammed against it with a metallic crack, sending sparks into the dust as Doug flailed in the passenger seat, half-conscious. Marcus pushed up from the dirt slowly, dragging his good leg underneath him, jaw clenched as he forced his body upright. Blood streaked down his jeans, warm and wet behind the knee, but nothing felt torn deep. It burned, but it didn't stop him. He turned toward the truck, just as Sherry threw it into reverse. Her expression twisted into something feral. Eyes wide, lips curled back. A snarl that barely belonged to a human. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her intent was painted across every twitch of her hands on the wheel. "Come on, Doug!" she screamed finally, slamming the gear shift again. "Get your dumb ass up!" Doug half fell out of the cab, still dragging one leg, and somehow managed to claw his way into the seat. Sherry leaned over and yanked the door shut herself before the truck lurched forward again, spitting gravel and smoke as it tore across the lot, throwing up a wall of dust behind it. Marcus limped into the open, watching them bounce through the exit gate, tail lights strobing through the clouds of grit like the last flare of a dying fuse. He didn't chase. Not yet. He stood there in the heat, in the silence that followed, the roar of the engine shrinking into the distance, the sting in his leg pulsing in time with his breath. His jaw was clenched, not from the pain, but from the clarity. They hadn't just made it personal. They hadn't just taken the step he'd waited for. They'd confirmed everything. This wasn't just racism or cowardice or ignorance. It was violence. Intentional, unprovoked, and escalating. He looked down at his jeans, at the blood beginning to soak through the torn denim, at the smear of gravel embedded in the skin of his elbow. He didn't wince, didn't curse, just exhaled through his nose and reached into his back pocket for his phone. He pulled up the plate number he'd memorized, GH7 2VX. He typed it into the notes. Then he paused. The image of Sherry's face behind the wheel lingered. Not the fear, not even the rage, but the certainty. She'd tried to kill him and thought she could get away with it. Just like she thought they could smear his walls with slurs. Just like she thought his silence would mean submission. They'd come into his space, bruised his peace, and now they were running again. Marcus stood there for a moment longer, the wind catching dust from the departing truck and throwing it in scattered gusts around his boots, the sting of grit mixing with the dull throb pulsing through his thigh. He glanced down again at the blood, dark against the torn denim, already starting to dry around the edges. The pain wasn't sharp. It was deep, controlled, like the bruising weight of something earned in silence. He flexed the leg once, gauging it. The muscles fired. No rupture, no tear, just damage he could work through. He limped toward the sedan. Not quickly, not frantically. Just with the same resolve he'd carried into the confrontation. The keys were already in his hand before he reached the door, and the moment he dropped into the driver's seat, the engine turned over with a familiar growl. He exhaled slowly through his nose, shifted into gear, and backed out of the lot in a wide arc, his eyes fixed on the faint twin trails of dust, still lingering in the road where the truck had roared through. They had made a mistake, not just in hitting him, not just in the cowardice of the act, but in assuming they could run. He took the corner hard, tires gripping pavement as he turned onto the service road and picked up speed, his hands steady on the wheel, body moving as if the pain weren't there, or at least didn't matter. The landscape blurred past in muted tones, withered fields, skeletal trees, a rusted billboard that had lost its lettering to storms long gone. Every flicker of movement on the road ahead was measured, analyzed, filed away. He scanned for them. No flash of red taillights, no plume of dust up ahead. But he knew they hadn't gone far. The truck was too old, too loud, too poorly handled to disappear for long. She was driving on rage, not sense. Doug probably wasn't even fully conscious. And their panic, however loud, had no plan. They'd head somewhere familiar, somewhere they thought no one would follow. Marcus knew these roads. Knew the arteries and back alleys, the dirt lanes that wrapped behind truck yards and abandoned service buildings. He took a right at the second intersection, off the main road, and down a narrow side lane that curved along the backs of several industrial lots. The light here was dimmer, the trees thicker. Oil drums sat half-rusted along the fences, like forgotten bones. Then, there, up ahead, a flash of movement. A red taillight bobbing at the edge of a sharp curve. Marcus didn't speed up. He adjusted, drew back slightly, kept the distance clean but constant. Sherry's driving hadn't improved. The truck swerved too hard into the next turn, clipped the shoulder, sent up a burst of loose gravel. She was overcorrecting, swinging wide like the fear in her hands was dragging the wheels sideways. Marcus kept to the shadows where he could, turning off his headlights as he coasted around the next bend, letting the sedan drift noiselessly on the descent. The hum of his engine was low, barely audible over the wind outside. His leg ached now with every press on the gas. But it didn't matter. Pain had always been part of the cost. The truck pulled into a clearing just off a power access road, an old concrete pad where a utility station used to stand, now long-gutted and fenced off. The tires crunched loudly as Sherry brought it to a rough stop near a pile of rusted scrap. Doug flopped against the passenger window, groaning, barely upright. Marcus parked behind a stand of trees 20 yards out. He killed the engine, sat for a moment, let the silence expand. Then he eased out of the car, wincing only slightly as his weight shifted to the injured leg. He stayed low, moved through the brush with deliberate care, boots brushing soft against dry leaves and gravel. The wind stirred again, catching the edge of his jacket, and the faint hiss of blood drying in the rip down his jeans. He didn't flinch. His breathing was slow, regulated. His eyes stayed locked on the truck. Sherry was pacing now, tight, frantic circles outside the cab, her phone in one hand, shouting into it. "Tried to kill us, Roy. I swear to God, he came out of nowhere and started swinging. Doug's all messed up. He can't even talk right. I don't care if it was his fault. I need someone here now." A pause. Then, "No, we can't go home. They'll be looking for us there. He's got connections. I told you. He's probably already called in his war buddies or whatever the hell they are." She started sobbing then, low and rasping, the kind of sob that came more from exhaustion than grief. Marcus watched from the trees. He didn't step forward. Not yet. He needed to know how far they'd go, what they'd admit, how many lies they'd layer over the truth, before the weight of their guilt finally cracked them open. But she wasn't finished. She kicked the gravel near Doug's side of the truck and shouted, "Get up! We gotta move again. They'll find us." Doug groaned. I can't feel my ribs." "You should have kept your damn mouth shut," she snapped. "Now we're both gonna pay for it." Marcus turned back toward the sedan. The lesson had been delivered. The pain had been felt. But now the walls were closing in, and they knew it. Soon, the stories they told about what happened wouldn't be enough. Soon, the rest of the town would see them for exactly what they were. By the time Marcus made it back to the sedan, the bleeding had slowed, but the damage had deepened. His thigh stiffening with every step, the ache now radiating with the heavy, deliberate rhythm of something that couldn't be ignored much longer. He slid into the driver's seat, easing his weight against the backrest with the kind of controlled exhale that only came from years of training through pain. The adrenaline had thinned now, leaving behind the low hum of exhaustion and the hard, quiet certainty that this wasn't over. But it had turned. He didn't go home. Didn't pull into the driveway, where the garage still bore the marks of what they'd done. He headed instead toward the south end of town, away from the houses, away from the silence of neighbors who knew too much and said too little. 20 minutes later, he pulled into the rear lot of an urgent care center he knew well, run by a former Navy corpsman named Porter who didn't ask questions, didn't flinch at old scars, and understood when a man came in alone and didn't want paperwork. Porter didn't say much when he saw the blood. He simply pointed toward the back exam room, pulled gloves on, and started cutting the jeans away with a practiced hand. The gash was deep but clean, a jagged tear where the edge of the bumper had torn through skin and muscle just above the knee. "You're lucky she wasn't a better driver," Porter muttered as he worked. stitching with quiet efficiency. Marcus didn't answer. He watched the ceiling, the sterile white light overhead casting long shadows across the walls. It wasn't luck. It was restraint. She hadn't missed because of mercy. She missed because hate makes people reckless. When it was done, Porter wrapped the leg in gauze and handed over a bottle of antibiotics. "You gonna report it?" he asked, voice low. "I already did," Marcus said, his voice calm, unreadable. "They just don't know it yet." He left the clinic without another word, stepping back into the cooling night air, the pain now anchored tightly around his thigh like a weight he carried on principle. He sat in the car for a long moment, engine running low, his phone glowing in his hand. He scrolled past contacts, clients, old friends, Reggie, until he reached the name he'd saved weeks ago when she first stepped onto his driveway with a badge and a clipboard. Detective Castillo. He pressed the call button. It rang twice. "Castillo," she answered, her tone clipped. "All business." "It's Trent," he said. "We need to talk." A pause. Then, "You hurt?" "Clipped," he replied. "Pickup truck. Deliberate. I've got plates, names, and motive." "Where are you?" "Half a mile from where they tried to kill me." Another pause. "This one heavier. Stay there," she said. "I'm coming." 20 minutes later, her unmarked cruiser pulled up beside the sedan beneath a dark stretch of road, headlights washing over the cracked pavement before shutting off. Castillo stepped out alone. No partner, no radio chatter, just a flashlight in one hand and a tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there the first time they met. Marcus stepped out slowly, careful not to favor the leg too much. She took one look and muttered, "Jesus, it's stable," he said. "I don't mean the leg," she replied. "I mean the fact you're still walking after what they did." She leaned against the hood of her car, flicking her light toward the roadside brush, as if scanning for whatever ghosts he might have left behind. "Start talking." He handed her a folder. Simple, thin, but heavy with names, timestamps, photos, plate numbers, and a written account of every movement Doug and Sherry Mallon had made in the past week. She flipped through it silently, eyes narrowing. This is detailed. It's what happens when you're trained to study targets and someone gives you a reason. She paused at a photo. The truck's tailgate, plastered with every angry slogan and sticker, frozen in frame at the gas station. Then another, Sherry screaming into her phone while Doug leaned against a dumpster, battered and slumped. "You sure about the license plate?" she asked. "I saw it twice. I memorized it the third time." She tucked the file under her arm. "Attempted vehicular homicide," she said softly. "I could get a judge to move on this tonight." "Do it," Marcus said. She glanced at him then, really looked at him. Not just the blood-stained wrap beneath his knee, or the lines of exhaustion carved into his expression, but the way he stood, the absolute stillness of him, the weight of someone who hadn't reacted out of rage, but resolve. "You planning to keep chasing them?" "I plan to be there when they stop running." She nodded once. No challenge, no lecture, just a shared understanding that this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about drawing a line the system kept letting people like Doug and Sherry step over without consequence. "I'll put out a regional APB," she said. "If they're anywhere near this county, they won't stay hidden for long. But you know how this goes. If I bring them in, they'll spin a story. They'll play the victim." "They can spin all they want," Marcus said, stepping back toward his car. "I've got the truth. And if that's not enough to bury them, I've still got one more lesson to teach." She didn't stop him as he climbed back into the sedan, didn't ask him to stay back, didn't warn him about crossing lines, because deep down, she knew he wasn't crossing them. He was dragging them into the light. The file was in Castillo's hands. The warrant was in motion. And yet, as Marcus pulled back out onto the road beneath the empty stretch of sky, something settled into his chest, like a stone. The quiet, familiar certainty that the system wouldn't get there in time. Not because Castillo wasn't trying, not because the paperwork wouldn't hold, but because men like Doug and women like Sherry had a lifetime of experience slipping between cracks they'd been told were never meant for them. They didn't think they'd be caught. Not really, because history had taught them the net always broke when it touched their skin. So Marcus drove, not in circles, not without aim, but with purpose. He wasn't chasing anymore. He was hunting. And every second he let pass was another inch they'd use to vanish. That phone call Sherry had made in the clearing, it had stuck with him. The desperation in her voice, the way she barked the name Roy like it was a lifeline, the frantic pitch when she screamed, "He's got connections, I told you." She hadn't been lying. She hadn't had time to. That call hadn't been a bluff. It had been a reach, for cover, for shelter, for whatever safety existed in a world where people like her still believed they were owed sanctuary. He started with what he knew. Roy. One syllable. But it was enough. He'd heard it twice. Once in the clearing, and once before, months ago, during a routine stop at a gun supply store just outside county lines. Marcus remembered the clerk, a gaunt man with pockmarked skin who kept photos of deer kills taped behind the counter like holy relics. He remembered the man bragging about a friend named Roy, some ex-foreman with land out near the river basin. Hundreds of acres, no cell towers, no one looking, the kind of place men like Doug could run to when life in town got too complicated. Marcus pulled over beneath a dead billboard just outside the industrial park and opened the small notepad he kept tucked in the glove box. In it, 100 scribbles of license plates, building names, phone numbers, and witness remarks. Halfway down the third page, there it was, Roy C., former boss, now off-grid near Flint Creek. He'd written it after hearing the name tossed around by another regular at the gym, a man who'd once worked construction with a crew that included Doug Mallon, before Doug got booted for starting a fight over a black supervisor being promoted. Marcus tapped the pen once against the notepad, then keyed the address into the Jeep. The route popped up, an hour southwest, past the old mill road, then deeper into unincorporated land, where law slowed down and fences grew taller. He didn't call Castillo. Not yet. He wasn't going there for a standoff. He was going to confirm a hunch. And if he was right, if Roy was harboring them, he'd have more than speculation to hand over. He'd have a location, a point of impact. Something real and immovable. The drive out of town was quiet, the night air growing heavier as the road narrowed into two-lane stretches lined with tall grass and rusted signs for roadside produce stands long since abandoned. The sedan rolled steady over gravel and broken pavement, and with each mile, the sky darkened into something thicker than evening, a blackness only found in places the grid didn't touch. At the edge of Flint Creek, Marcus pulled off onto a dirt path half swallowed by brush. The GPS flickered once, then lost signal. He killed the headlights and coasted forward, engine humming low, tires crunching over roots and packed earth. Up ahead, faint light, dim and orange, a cabin, a fire pit still smoking, and the unmistakable bulk of the Mallon's truck parked off to the side, barely visible beneath a threadbare tarp, and a camouflage net that looked like it had been dragged out of an old hunting shed. He cut the engine. Silence. Then, slowly, he stepped out of the car, keeping to the shadows, boots light over the forest floor. He moved along the tree line, eyes locked on the cabin's silhouette, wood siding, a wraparound porch, one lantern burning inside, swaying slightly in the breeze. A figure moved past the window, too tall to be Sherry. Roy. Another shape, heavier, slower, shuffled behind him. Doug, still limping, hunched, the fight still written in the way he walked. And then Sherry appeared, leaning in close to Roy, whispering something, her face twitching with urgency. She pointed once toward the back door, gestured again toward the truck, then reached for a bottle on the table. Marcus stepped back into the cover of the trees. They weren't planning to stay long. Whatever safe haven this was, it was temporary, just a stop on the road to somewhere farther out. She was already preparing, already packing. He pulled out his phone. No signal. He walked 20 paces back toward the ridge. Still nothing. He kept walking. At 40 paces, a flicker. Then 1 bar. He dialed. Castillo answered immediately. "Talk. I found them," Marcus said, voice low, steady. "Flint Creek. Property off the Basin Road. Looks like they've got a friend out here. Roy C., maybe 60. Ex-construction. The truck's here. They're inside now, but not for long. You sure? I'm looking at them. Stay out of sight," she said quickly. "I'll call it in. County backup only. If you're seen—" "I won't be," Marcus said, eyes fixed on the cabin. She didn't argue. She just said, "We're coming." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his jacket. Breath evening out, body bracing against the ache still pulsing in his leg. This time, they wouldn't get away. Not into the woods, not behind lies, and not before the world saw them clearly for what they truly were. Marcus rose from his crouch beneath the pines with the calm of a man who had made peace with what came next. The pain in his leg pulsed with heat now, sharp under each step. But it didn't matter. He moved with quiet urgency, cutting between brush and tree, circling wide until the cabin rose directly ahead, its weather-worn siding catching the last breath of moonlight, one lantern still flickering behind the sagging curtain in the window. He stayed low as he approached the porch, each footfall placed with the discipline of a man who had crossed enemy thresholds in silence more times than he could count. There was no room for nerves, no space for second-guessing. Not now. They were leaving, and if they made it out of this clearing, if the truck disappeared into the woods before backup arrived, the story would change. They'd spin it, twist it, smear it into something unrecognizable, and the truth would go quiet again. He crept along the edge of the porch until he reached the window, rising just enough to see inside. Doug was on his feet, barely upright, hunched over with a bandage wrapped tight around his ribs, sweat pouring down his face as he leaned against the wall. Sherry moved with sharp, impatient gestures, stuffing a duffel with loose clothes and what looked like money, shouting something to Roy, who was pacing near the rear door, rifle slung over one shoulder. "Truck's ready," Roy snapped, his voice muffled. "You want out? You go now." "We go when I say," Sherry shot back. "We don't leave until we've burned every piece of this behind us." Marcus didn't wait for the next word. He rose fully, crossed the porch in 3 steps, and kicked the door open so hard the hinges cracked. It smashed against the inside wall with a thunderous slam, and for one long second, everything stopped. Sherry dropped the bag. Doug stumbled upright. Roy turned, the rifle swinging down, too slow. Marcus was already inside. He charged Roy first, crossing the floor like a storm breaking through branches. The older man tried to raise the weapon, but Marcus struck it before it cleared his shoulder, sending the barrel wide with a brutal forearm. The rifle fired, deafening and blind, the round tearing into the far wall as Roy staggered back into a wooden post. Marcus didn't hesitate. He drove his knee into Roy's chest and followed with a short surgical elbow to the side of the head. The man collapsed sideways, dropping the rifle as he hit the floor, breath knocked clean from his lungs. Doug roared, no weapon in hand, just fury. He charged like a wounded animal, arms wide, trying to grab, to pin, to drag Marcus down by weight alone. But Marcus pivoted, caught Doug's momentum, and slammed him shoulder first into the side wall. The drywall cracked, and Doug howled, staggering back with a wild punch that Marcus ducked easily. He came up from the crouch with a hook that connected clean against Doug's jaw, snapping the man's head sideways. Doug stumbled, but didn't fall. Not yet. He swung again, sloppy, desperate. Marcus blocked it, then punished it with 2 fast strikes to the gut, followed by a palm to the chest that sent Doug crashing into the dining table. Plates clattered. Glass shattered. The table tipped with a groan and went down. Sherry screamed something behind him. Marcus turned, too late. The cast-iron skillet struck him just below the shoulder, sending white-hot pain lancing down his back. He staggered, eyes blurred, and Sherry raised the pan again with both hands, shrieking. All reason gone. He caught her wrist on the second swing, twisted. The pan fell. She clawed at his face with her free hand, nails raking across his jaw, but Marcus shoved her hard into the wall behind the fridge. She hit with a loud thud and crumpled to the floor, coughing, gasping. Doug was back up, bleeding, eyes wild, fists clenched. He grabbed the leg of a broken chair and charged again, roaring. Marcus took the hit on the side, the wood striking with enough force to make him stumble. But he absorbed it, turned into it, and delivered a brutal strike across Doug's temple with the side of his forearm. Doug's knees buckled. Still not down. Still not done. Marcus grabbed him by the front of his shirt and threw him bodily across the room into the couch, sending the man crashing through it and onto the floor on the other side. The cabin trembled with silence. For a breath. Then Sherry came at him again, this time with a kitchen knife, low, fast, aiming for the ribs. Marcus sidestepped, caught her wrist, and slammed it against the edge of the counter. She shrieked as the blade dropped. Then he gripped her by the collar and turned her toward the wall, pressing her face first into it, with one arm braced against her shoulder. "Enough," he breathed. She struggled, squirmed, cursed into the wood. Then she went still. Behind him, Doug moaned weakly on the floor, coughing, still trying to push himself upright with trembling arms. Roy was still down, unmoving but breathing. Marcus didn't let go. Not yet. He waited, ears tuned to every sound. The creak of floorboards, the groan of the wind outside, then, faint at first, but growing louder, sirens, red and blue flashing through the trees beyond the porch. Backup was here. He released Sherry and stepped back, standing tall in the center of the wrecked cabin, blood smeared across his cheek, glass and plaster dust in his hair, his body screaming from bruises and blunt force, but his posture never broke. He released Sherry and stepped back, standing tall in the center of the wrecked cabin, blood smeared across his cheek, glass and plaster dust in his hair, his body screaming from bruises and blunt force, but his posture never broke. The door swung open behind him. Castillo entered first, sidearm raised, 2 deputies behind her. She took in the scene. Her eyes landed on Marcus. He gave a slow nod. "They're all yours." The moment Castillo stepped through the doorway, the tension in the room shifted, not because the danger had passed, but because it had changed hands. Marcus stayed exactly where he was, shoulders squared, one hand resting lightly against the edge of the counter, blood trickling from a cut at his temple, breath steady but laced with effort. Behind him, the sounds of groaning bodies and broken furniture filled the cabin in slow, uneven waves. Doug wheezing from the far wall, Sherry hissing curses through clenched teeth as she leaned against the wrecked kitchen island, and Roy still crumpled near the fireplace, clutching his wrist like the bones inside had turned to glass. Castillo's sidearm didn't lower until both deputies swept through and cleared the corners. Then, as her eyes adjusted fully to the wreckage, she let out a breath that wasn't quite surprise, just confirmation. She holstered her weapon and stepped deeper into the room. "You didn't wait," she said. Marcus turned to face her, jaw tight, one eye swelling beneath a bruised arc of skin. "Didn't have time." Her gaze swept over Sherry, who flinched when one of the deputies reached to cuff her, and then to Doug, who tried to speak, but could only spit blood into his lap. Castillo moved slowly, deliberately, walking the room like she was marking a battlefield, eyes trailing from overturned chairs to shattered glass to the rifle lying forgotten near Roy's foot. "No shots fired from your side?" she asked quietly. "No weapons drawn," Marcus replied. "Only what they brought with them." Castillo nodded once. Then she turned to her team. "Get them processed. Full booking, assault, attempted homicide, hate crimes. I want the warrant refreshed and extended before they even think about calling a lawyer." Sherry lurched forward. "You can't. He attacked us." You were fleeing with weapons, Castillo said, flat and unmoved. Your prints are all over the property. We have witness testimony, video evidence, a vandalized house, and a truck loaded with stolen goods, and a blood trail that stretches halfway to your own doorstep. Doug tried to sit upright. He set us up. He coughed. He's been stalking us. He jumped us. Save it for court, she said, without even looking at him. Where you'll finally find out what it feels like to answer for something. A third cruiser pulled up outside, and another pair of deputies moved in to assist, securing Roy, who barely protested, too dazed to speak. Marcus stayed in the corner, quiet, eyes flicking between the movements, not interfering, not speaking unless addressed. The rage was gone from him now, not replaced by relief, but by something heavier. The mission was nearly complete, but not finished. Sherry twisted toward Castillo as her hands were cuffed behind her back. We were protecting ourselves. He came after us because we stood up for our rights. That's not a crime. No, Castillo said, stepping closer. But attempted murder is. So is hate-motivated assault. So is vandalism of a veteran's home. And the fact that you're still trying to paint yourselves as victims tells me exactly how far gone you really are. Sherry's mouth curled open like she was preparing another shriek, but no words came, because there was nothing left to twist. Doug groaned as two deputies lifted him off the floor, his head lolling sideways as Marcus finally stepped forward, wincing as his weight shifted onto the leg Sherry's truck had clipped days earlier. The bandage had soaked through again. The pain had spread, but he didn't complain. He just walked to the porch and leaned against the railing, watching as the deputies began loading the Malins into separate cruisers. Castillo joined him a moment later, standing beside him in silence. It was a long time before either of them spoke. You did what I couldn't, she said quietly. What the system couldn't. I didn't want to, Marcus replied. But they made it clear they weren't going to stop unless someone did. She looked down at his hands, bloodied knuckles, dirt in the creases, fingers still trembling with the residue of force. You going to be okay? She asked. Physically? He shrugged. Eventually. And the rest? He didn't answer at first. His eyes were still on the tree line, where the wind had begun to shift again, carrying with it the faint sound of another cruiser approaching. Then the sudden hush as it came to a stop. The part that gets to me, he said finally, is how many chances they had, how many warnings I gave, how far they had to push before anyone believed me. Castillo didn't respond. She didn't have to. The weight of what he said sat between them like smoke that refused to clear. Another deputy stepped up behind her. We've secured the house. Press is already picking up the call from dispatch. This is gonna go public. Castillo nodded. Let it. The deputy hesitated. They're asking if the suspect was armed. Castillo looked at Marcus, then back at the officer. No, she said, but they should be asking why he had to act alone. The deputy nodded once and returned to his post. Castillo stepped down from the porch, giving Marcus one last glance before joining the officers at the cruisers. The Malins were quiet now, finally subdued by the gravity of their own unraveling. Doug hung his head against the window. Sherry stared forward, mouth set in a stiff, bitter line. But the eyes were hollow. She knew. Everyone would know. Marcus remained on the porch, eyes steady, body aching, breath slow. Justice didn't always come with celebration. Sometimes it came bruised and quiet, wearing the face of a man who refused to let hate keep breathing. The news broke before sunrise. By the time the Malins were processed and locked behind holding cell doors, their names were already threaded through every local feed, their faces captured in grainy snapshots taken from behind cruiser windows, eyes swollen, shirts bloodied, expressions stripped bare of the smugness they once wore like armor. The story moved quickly, first as a local bulletin about a cabin raid, then as something heavier, something uglier, something true. By mid-morning, every screen in town flickered with footage of the Malins' arrest, paired with headlines that didn't pull punches. Racist couple arrested after attempted hit and run on decorated veteran. Veteran takes down suspects in hate crime spree. Locals speak out. We always knew something was off. The town that once looked away now couldn't stop staring. At the grocery store on 5th, the same cashier who'd once laughed nervously when Doug made a joke about real Americans stood behind the counter stiffly, staring at the screen above the lottery machine as Sherry's mugshot scrolled by. In the auto shop, where Doug used to swagger in with beer on his breath and hate in his teeth, the manager shook his head slowly and muttered to no one in particular, "I should have said something when he bragged about spray painting that truck a year back." Neighbors, ones who had lived just a few doors down from Marcus, began calling into radio shows, leaving comments on news posts, all echoing a single truth no one had dared say aloud until now. "We always saw that truck. He had a sticker on it that said, 'We don't kneel.' Another one with a noose and a flag. It was disgusting. They came into my diner once and made a scene because I had a Black Lives Matter pin on my apron. It came not as a flood, but a quiet, relentless wave. People remembering, people rethinking, people realizing what it meant that they had seen that truck, those flags, those slogans, those smug glares, and said nothing. That they had crossed the street, lowered their eyes, bit their tongues. Now, the town had no more room for silence. Marcus watched it all from his living room, leg elevated, a deep, pulsing bruise wrapped in fresh gauze beneath his jeans. The house had been cleaned, the garage repainted, but he'd left one slur uncovered behind the trash bin. Not out of oversight, but as a reminder, a scar the building would carry just long enough to remind him that peace never came easy. The television played low in the background, the volume barely above a whisper. Castillo was speaking now, her voice steady, firm. The backdrop behind her lined with sheriff's office banners and press microphones. "There is no scenario," she said, "where it is acceptable to chase a man down in his own town, in front of his own home, and expect the system to look away. There will be charges, and there will be justice." Marcus leaned back against the couch cushions and let the words sit. It wasn't pride he felt. It wasn't satisfaction. It was stillness, the kind of stillness that came after everything had been broken, after the smoke cleared, and the wreckage could be seen for what it was. He hadn't wanted a spotlight. He hadn't needed the headlines. But now that they were here, now that the world had been forced to see what he'd carried alone, he didn't flinch. His phone buzzed with messages. "Reggie, saw the press conference. You handled it. Proud of you, man." Porter, "Got a dozen vets ready to stand with you if this thing drags." Even Castillo had texted once, late last night after the booking. "They'll spin. Let them. The truth will hold." And it did. The town didn't rally to the Mallons' defense. There were no protests outside the courthouse, no donors coming forward to cover bail, no sympathetic op-eds trying to reframe their story. There was only distance, people crossing streets when they passed the Mallons' names, former friends unfriending, deleting, blocking, and walking the other way. Even Roy's property, once a quiet haven, had been cordoned off with tape and marked for further investigation. Trespassing, harboring fugitives, accessory after the fact. Charges stacked like cordwood. Marcus stepped outside later that evening, just as the sun dipped behind the houses, casting the neighborhood in long shadows that finally felt like they were beginning to lift. A few houses down, the same man who had once turned his back on the night of the vandalism gave a silent nod as he dragged his trash to the curb. It wasn't a gesture of redemption. It was one of recognition, and that was enough. The wind passed over the rooftops in a long, low exhale, carrying with it the smell of cut grass and distant barbecue smoke. The silence that returned wasn't empty anymore. It felt earned. He stood for a while on the porch, his legs still heavy, his breath deep, the weight on his shoulders lighter than it had been in weeks. The fight was over, but the message remained. Some people learned the lesson the first time. Some needed to be taught. and others, like the Mallons, had to be broken open before they finally heard the truth ringing in the quiet that followed. There are consequences, even here, even now, especially now. The courtroom didn't erupt when the sentences came down. There were no outbursts. No begging, no apologies, just the flat, matter-of-fact cadence of a judge reading names and dates and charges, stacking years like bricks, building a wall between Doug and Sherry Mallon and the world they had tried so hard to poison. 22 years, consecutive, no parole for the first 15. Doug stared at the floor, hands slack on the table. Sherry said nothing, her mouth pressed into a thin, trembling line, as her eyes drifted toward the window, like she could still imagine a way out, if only she looked far enough. They weren't looking at Marcus. They hadn't for a while now. He sat in the back row of the gallery, braced by silence, his posture steady, his presence calm. He hadn't come for closure. He'd already taken that in the cabin. What he came for was completion, so that the system would echo what his fists had already made clear. He left before the press could descend. Outside, the air was sharp with early October wind, the courthouse steps awash in camera flashes and murmurs from townsfolk who weren't whispering anymore. For weeks, the town had done nothing but whisper, but that silence had cracked wide open. It wasn't just about the assault, or the vandalism, or the bruises that still lined Marcus's ribs. It was about the fact that people had watched that truck drive through their streets for years, dripping with venom, and never once stopped it. Until now. The Mallons' faces were everywhere, on news feeds, in print, discussed in grocery lines and on radio segments, but no one called them victims. No one defended them. And what surprised Marcus most wasn't the justice handed down, but what happened next. The donations started 2 days later. At first it was quiet. A check slipped into his mailbox from someone who didn't sign it. Then a knock at the door from Reggie with an envelope in hand, and a stubborn refusal to take it back. Then the grocery store manager, whose eyes had gone wide when Marcus walked in, came from behind the counter, handed him a gift card, and mumbled, "For everything they ruined." Within a week, Castillo mentioned a local fundraiser that had started without her even knowing. Set up by the high school civics teacher. No speeches, no slogans, just a quiet note on the community board. For repairs. For dignity. For the man who stood when we didn't. The goal was $5,000. It doubled in 4 days. Marcus didn't touch it at first. He let the account sit untouched, unsure whether accepting help now after doing everything alone felt right. But when he looked at the receipts from the contractors, the paint, the drywall, the electrical work needed after the vandalism, and then at the half-repaired back gate that had never fully closed since the night Sherry tore it open with the bumper of her truck, he realized something. Letting people help wasn't weakness. It was proof that the lesson had landed. That finally, after all the silence and complicity and looking away, they were choosing to say something. The garage was restored in full by the end of the second week. Clean lines, fresh paint, new fixtures, but one section of the inner wall, tucked near the back corner, had been left uncovered by Marcus's request. A single word, one of the ones they had spray-painted in screaming red, now protected behind glass, framed with quiet intention, not to honor the pain, but to remember it. The porch light had been replaced, the trim repainted, the yard mended where the signpost had been torn down during the confrontation. The flag that had once flown there, ripped, shredded, used as a weapon against his identity, now rested inside, framed behind tempered glass, with the burn marks still visible on the lower edge. People passed his house differently now. Not with fear, not with pity, but with respect. The man across the street, who hadn't said a word the day of the vandalism, crossed over one afternoon while Marcus was working on the front bushes. He didn't apologize, didn't flinch, just offered a firm handshake, looked him in the eye, and said, "You held that line better than any of us ever did." Marcus nodded. Nothing more. That was enough. He returned to the gym the next week. Reggie didn't make a scene, just tossed him a towel and grinned. 12 rounds on the bag. Before you even think about cardio. Marcus obliged. The ache in his leg still lingered, but it had settled into something familiar, like scar tissue that reminded the body of what it had survived. That evening, he walked the block again, the same path, the same streets. But everything was different now, not because the town had transformed overnight, but because it had acknowledged what it used to let slide. People nodded now, some waved, some kept their distance, but none looked away. The final piece came in the form of a letter. Unmarked envelope. No return address. Tucked inside was a short note, handwritten. You taught this town something we should have known already. Thank you. Use this to finish the job. Inside, a cashier's check. $10,000. Marcus stared at it for a long time. He never cashed it. He donated it to a local scholarship fund, naming it after a friend from his unit. Quiet, like everything else he did. Because this was never about what he could gain. It was about what he couldn't allow. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops that night and the streetlights clicked on one by one, Marcus stood on his porch, the wind lifting gently through the trees. His house stood whole again. His silence no longer misunderstood. He turned toward the door, stepped inside. And this time, when he closed it behind him, it wasn't to shut the world out. It was to let peace in. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.